There was a European family that decided to have their newborn baby dedication in their enormous mansion. Dozens of guests were invited to the elaborate affair, and they all arrived dressed elegantly. After depositing their wraps and jackets on a bed in an upstairs room, the guests were eventually entertained royally. And soon the time came for the main purpose of the gathering, the infant ceremony. But where's the baby? No one seemed to know. The child's governess ran upstairs and returned with a desperate look on her face. Everyone searched frantically for the baby. Then someone recalled having seen him asleep on one of the beds. The baby was on a bed, all right, hidden behind a pile of coats and jackets and furs. The object of the day's celebration had been forgotten and neglected and nearly smothered. The baby whose birthday we celebrate at Christmas is also just as easily hidden beneath piles of traditions and cultural observances of the season. But it's one that we need to remember, and we need to remember well, the birth of this baby. Today we get to remember the very last part of the Christmas story together, because Christmas may be over, but the story of Jesus has really just begun, hasn't it? Christmas may be over, but the story has just begun. In many traditions, January 6th, yesterday, would be called the Day of Epiphany. And it's a day where the church, in church history, that they have set apart to remember the wise men and remember what happened following his birth. And we're going to look at a couple of different stories today and remember some of these things that happened following the amazing birth and the stories that we have remembered and celebrated over the last number of weeks. You know, Christmas isn't really over with the end of opening gifts on the 25th. And I'm not talking about the boxes of recycling that you still have sitting at home, the tons of paper piled up ready to go out in your blue bin. What's not over is the Christmas story. It carries on. You know, those who saw the signs and celebrated the glory of this newborn Savior, it started with his birth, but it definitely did not end there. There are two stories that we don't talk about often, but that I want to look at today with you. The first will be in Luke chapter 2, and it's not going to show up on the screen. It's going to just be something that I want to read to you this morning, but it's in Luke chapter 2. And it is shortly after the birth of Jesus. The angels had visited the shepherds, and the shepherds had gone and visited with the baby born in that manger. But we often stop there at the end of verse 20. We often stop where after those shepherds left, they went on and told everybody what they had been told. But there's more to it than that. The text goes on from there. It talks about how on the 8th day, as the next verse, they went and they took Jesus to be circumcised, as was their custom. And they went and they did that. And then it follows on and goes even further. And then it says when the time for purification had come, they took him to the temple. And this would have been about 40 days after his birth, that they went to make the sacrifices for their family, for Jesus and Mary, for cleansing as well as a presentation of Jesus to the temple priests. They would have sacrificed. They had a couple of options, 2 pigeons or 2 doves, depending on the money that they had. And they would have taken this firstborn male son, as was the custom, as was described in Leviticus, and consecrated him to the Lord, presented him saying, "This baby you have given us, God, we are consecrating for you and for your glory." And then we see a couple of people who met them there. So as I read this story for you today, I want you to listen to it with those things in mind of what was happening, just trying to set the scene a little bit. I want you to close your eyes and imagine with me as they walked into the temple 40 days later, as they walked in on the stone floor and the beautiful stone walls rising around them, as they entered into the courtyard or the outer courts, and there would be some in the corners at tables selling pigeons and doves for the sacrifices of the day. There would be priests walking about piously with their purple garb and their tall headdresses, conversations happening in pockets of people around them as they walked in. And then in walked Joseph and Mary holding this little 1-month-old baby, avoiding the rough spots, walking carefully around the people who may bump into them. This is what we read. It says, when the time of their purification according to the law of Moses had been completed, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem and presented him to the Lord, as it was written in the law of the Lord. Every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of 2 doves or 2 young pigeons. Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Christ. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the customs of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you prepared in the sight of all people, a light of revelation to the Gentiles, and for glory to your people Israel. The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. Now there was also a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel, the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage and then was widowed until she was 84. She had never left the temple but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. Can you imagine being Mary and Joseph and walking in to the temple, walking into the outer courts, ready to make their presentation of their 2 birds for sacrifice, and to finish this ritual, this remembrance and consecration of their new baby to the Lord? They had already seen some amazing things from the star and the shepherds and the angels visiting them. And then as they go to the temple, in come Simeon and in come Anna. Imagine this man coming up, taking their child in his arms and praising God. I imagine him lifting him up. It doesn't say that, but I imagine him holding this little 1-month-old baby and just saying, God, my eyes have seen your glory because of this new baby. My eyes have seen your salvation. You have prepared it in the sight of all people, a light of revelation for the Gentiles and glory for the people of Israel. Simeon saw and declared the glory to all people. That this little baby was going to be for all people, a revelation to the Gentiles and glory for Israel. What I found fascinating as I was reading over this passage again this week is he seems to have got what all of the priests had missed, right? When you begin to read through the rest of the gospel story, they didn't see what this new Messiah, what this Christ meant for them and for all of the Gentiles. But Simeon here, he saw it. He was given a gift by God, it says. He says, just as you have promised, you can now dismiss me, for my eyes have seen your salvation. For all people, Gentiles and for Israel. What would that have been like for Mary and Joseph? To stand there and watch this man declare this over your little baby. I think they knew some of it, obviously, because the angel had shown up. They had seen all of these amazing things. But you can imagine what it would be like as God reveals step by step a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more of how special this child really is. And we know it didn't end there. Another person approaches, this time Anna, a prophetess, a female prophet. Prophet literally would translate from Hebrew to English as a mouthpiece of God. That's what she was there for. It says that in the passage that we read that she was married for 7 years and then widowed and then spent the rest of her life fasting and praying and worshiping in the temple, and it says that she was 84. How old are you, Harry? 89, not quite as old. But the text says that she was very old. I don't think of Harry as very old, but 89 would qualify, I think. She would have been widowed approximately if she married early, as in the average age, say in her teen years, and was married 7 years. She could have easily been widowed for 60 years. In 6 decades, it says that she spent her time fasting and praying and worshiping at the temple. And so this prophetess, this Anna, came and also gave thanks to God and spoke about how this little one would bring about the redemption of Jerusalem. Christmas didn't end with the birth of Jesus. It was only just beginning. That's what Simeon saw. That's what Anna saw, that the birth of this baby was just the beginning, that we remember and we celebrate, but we recognize that there is so much more yet to come from this life. It says that when they finished the requirements of the law, they then headed back to Galilee. And it says at the end of verse 39 and 40, I didn't read them for you, but 40 says, "And the child grew up and became strong, and he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him." So they went back to their hometown in Galilee following the completion of these rituals. Now, the Christmas story isn't even over there, actually. It carries on, and it's found in the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 2. And I want to read a little bit of that story for you today as well. But we see here a little bit more of what happened in the early days in the narrative of Jesus' life. I want to read for you Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. And again, you can close your eyes and just listen to these verses if you want. And just place yourself in the place. Try to picture what's going on in your mind. It says that after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. "Well, in Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet is written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. And he sent them and said to Bethlehem and said, "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented to him with gifts of gold and of incense and of myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. These magi, these wise men, saw a star and came to worship at the feet of this child. There's been much written about these wise men. Where did they come from? What was their purpose? How did they know to follow this star? But we find little hints within the text that gives us just a little bit of information about them. We know that they came and followed from the east. Commonly, it's thought it could be Persia, which would be present-day Iran. But many scholars also think that it could have been in the Arabian Peninsula, what is now Yemen, just below Saudi Arabia. Because in this little peninsula is both where myrrh and frankincense are grown and produced naturally. They originate on their own there, and they would have easily been traded for gold into Africa and into other places. And so anywhere east over there is a likely location where they could have come from. But they weren't from Jerusalem, and I think that's the key point. That these wise men had come from somebody different, from some place different, in these Gentiles who came. Their history is up for much debate, but what isn't up for debate is what they did. They saw a miraculous star. It was so bright that they knew that this star was different than everything around it. It was unique, and it marked something unique that happened in the world. They knew of a story where a king's birth would be marked by this glorious star, and they prepared and set out to follow it, to find out and to worship the king who is now born. What I find fascinating about this is the revelation of God that we find within this text. That God declared this not only to the shepherds and the Jews and to Simeon and Anna and to Mary and Joseph, but he declared it broader and bigger than that. And it's sort of symbolic, but it goes way more. There's way more than just symbolism within here about these Gentile believers who come to worship at the feet of Jesus. It's a fulfillment of even what the prophet Simeon declared, right? That this one would be for the forgiveness or freedom of all Gentiles and bring glory back to Israel. As I've got to study a little bit of history, we can see remnants or sprinkling of God's story and his plan throughout many different cultures around the world. And we don't know where the wise men heard about this story. Some say that maybe it was stories that were shared with them when Israel was taken off into captivity in the Old Testament. People like Daniel in the book of Daniel who went off, and they may have shared some of the stories from the prophets of old. And maybe that's where the wise men first heard about it. But I know that there are sprinklings where God's Holy Spirit has been at work all over the world in different cultures and different places. And in some ways, it's waiting for the truth of Jesus to be made known to them. And then they see God at work within their past as well. Did you know that right here in North America, one case where I've seen it, and I looked it up just to make sure this week, but it's not only in the Lakota tribe, in the First Nations tribe, but there are numerous tribes where they have a history, a telling that their elders will tell, that at some point there will be a pure and spotless white buffalo that will be born, and this white buffalo will save us. It's very interesting, isn't it? Sounds a lot like the Old Testament when they talked about the lamb, the white and spotless pure lamb that would come and would save us. There are numerous tribes that remember that and that tell that story of the white buffalo who will come, and through him you will find salvation. Makes me wonder, what's God up to? How is he going to use that? What is going on? And I think for us, it opens up a doorway where we can share our story with others. Not far from here, just a little west of Rosetown, just outside the small village of Herschel, there is a white buffalo rubbing rock, they call it, and it's a sacred place in their tradition, a place where tribes would meet and leaders would meet and gather. But it's in a remembrance of that one day there will be a white, spotless buffalo who will come and save us. I think that white buffalo has already come. In many ways, tying what God is doing to what he has already done is something that we can do as followers of Jesus. These magi in our story, or these wise men, knew that the star meant something and meant something special. And they intended to go and worship this king. And as the story goes, they made their journey, and when they came to Jerusalem, they did what they thought was right. They stopped at the local leader's house, at King Herod's house, and asked, because they figured, I would imagine, that other people would have noticed this star too. And if we're going to look for a king likely comes from the line of the king, and we should stop and ask. But when word came that the prophecy was for them to be born in Bethlehem, King Herod began to plot his revenge for his future. That if these wise men are coming from another country to worship at a king who isn't him, then he needs to do something to put a stop to this. The king sent them off to Bethlehem, he says. But notice that it doesn't say the wise men went to Bethlehem. It says after that the star shone again, and they followed the star directly to Jesus. We don't know exactly when these wise men arrived. It could be anywhere up to 2 years after Christ's birth. But probably in that first time frame somewhere, these wise men arrived, likely in Galilee, where Joseph and Mary and Jesus had settled. The text doesn't say all of that, but we can put it together and make a best guess. And I think that's also why Herod had trouble finding this baby Jesus after. And we know that Herod, then following this, sent out word that he wanted every baby born in Bethlehem to be murdered, every male child that was 2 years old and younger. And Jesus and Mary and Joseph escaped to Egypt, where they stayed until it was safe to return. The wise men came because they saw something great, and they came to worship at the feet of this God. They brought their gifts, they presented them. However, there's more to Christmas than just gifts. And there was more to their gift than just giving to Jesus. They were there to worship a new king born to a new world. I have a short video clip that I want to show you, and it's the last of our series, introducing us to the wise men.
God had been silent for 400 years. We knew because we were listening, in a sense. My job is to listen. You wouldn't call a person that talks a lot a wise man, would you? No, you'd call them many, many, many things, but a wise man wouldn't be one of them. My position is to look for signs everywhere. A star, for example. I can look at a star and watch it and wait and see what the star is trying to tell us. I read one time of a star that would announce a new king. And then one day, there it was. A beacon in the night. A star unlike any other star I'd ever seen before. And so, I followed it. Several of us, we followed this star. It was bizarre. The star would lead, it would move, and we would follow. Our journey took 2 years, and it led us to Judea. And then the star stopped. It just stopped, shining down over this small cottage. Our journey ended not at a palace for a king, but at a home for a peasant. This was it. I mean, we gathered our thoughts, we gathered our gifts, we did all that we could do to contain our emotion. And behind those doors was a new king. A king that could command the stars in the sky and yet chose to dwell among us. A king that spoke and the word became flesh. God was finished being silent. That night, we knelt. We bowed down before this baby boy. And each one of us laid gifts at his feet. We had to, we couldn't help it. 400 years of silence, broken by the cries of the Son of God.
It's about more than just a king. It's about the king who broke the silence, the one who was born to a virgin named Mary, the one whose stars announced his birth, the one who angels appeared to announce his birth to the shepherds in the field, to people like you and me, to the shepherds who came to see and worship and declare the glorious birth of this king. Now, the priests may have missed the significance of this birth when Jesus was presented in the temple, but Simeon did not. He recognized that this birth would change the world, that it would be a revelation to the Gentiles, and it would bring glory to Israel. Anna, having worshipped and prayed and fasted for over 6 years, also knew that this baby was special. And it says she began to tell everyone about it. And the silence of God was broken. You know, Christmas was just the beginning. The epiphany of Christ doesn't end with his presentation at the temple or his worship from some wise men who came to see him. It's carried on in us today. But the same questions are asked of us. Will we recognize his lordship? Will we make him king in our life? Will we follow him? Will we go wherever he leads us? Will we remember this year that Christmas was just the beginning? I want to invite the worship team to come up, and they have a song for us to respond to. But those questions still remain. What will we do in the days ahead, recognizing that this king and his coming was just the beginning?